Okay, this is hands-on exercise number 2 from chapter 5. In this hands-on exercise, we're going to talk about pivot table basics. We're going to cover creating a pivot table, adding rows and values and columns to a pivot table, removing and rearranging fields from a pivot table, changing the value settings, and refreshing a pivot table. I don't normally do this, but I want to read to you from the book real quick about what a pivot table is. A pivot table is a powerful interactive data mining feature that enables you to summarize and analyze data, especially helpful when you're working with large data sets. An advantage of using a pivot table is that you can group data into one or more categories and perform a variety of calculations without altering the original data set. The most important benefit of a pivot table is that it's dynamic. You can easily and quickly pivot or rearrange data to analyze them from different viewpoints, such as expanding or collapsing details, organizing and grouping data differently, and switching row and column categories. Viewing the pivot table from different perspectives helps you more easily identify trends and patterns among the variables in the data that might not be obvious from looking at the data from only one viewpoint. So that's kind of the basics behind a pivot table, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, we're working with the sociology file, and you want to be on the Books Data tab along the bottom. Go ahead and put your cursor into cell A5. We're going to go to the Insert tab along the top, and we've done table. We did that in chapter 4. Now we're working with pivot tables here. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and click on the recommended pivot table to see what Excel might give us. And Excel gives us our data summarized in a variety of different viewpoints. So this first one is sum of units sold wholesale by discipline, sum of unit price wholesale by discipline, sum of sales, and so on. There's a variety of ones that we can choose from that Excel has created for us. We're going to go ahead and sum of total book sales by discipline, which is about the 4th one down. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and click OK. Alright, on a new sheet, so we're not changing the data from the original sheet, but on a new sheet we have created a pivot table. What it gives us is the sum of total book sales by discipline. Now if we look, there's a little plus sign next to each one of the disciplines. If we click on those plus signs, we see that it has the areas underneath it. So the discipline would be criminal justice, and here's the 5 areas underneath that. So we can collapse and expand those particular areas as we see fit. What you should also notice on the screen, in addition to the pivot table, is what you see on the right hand side of the screen, and that's the pivot table fields, and that shows us the design of the pivot table. We can easily move things around to change the view of the pivot table itself. So one of the things that we're going to do is add some fields from the list of available fields to our actual pivot table. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag addition. I'm just going to hold down the left mouse button, and I'm going to put addition into the columns area. So now along the top I have addition number 1 through 10, and I have on the rows the disciplines and the areas. Okay, I'm sorry, we have disciplines and book titles as we see down in the rows. So what we have now in our pivot table: disciplines, underneath that book titles, and then additions in the columns. Let's go ahead and drag the copyright field in between discipline and book title, and I'll just drop it in there. So now when we go ahead and expand that, I have the discipline, the copyright year, and then the book titles underneath that particular copyright year. And again, we have across the columns, we have 1 through 10 representing our additions. Now we're going to remove and rearrange some of the things that we've already done. If I go over here to addition in the columns area and I click on the drop down, one of the things that I can do is remove field, and we're going to go ahead and do that right now. So we're going to remove columns from the pivot table. The other thing that we're going to remove is the book titles. So we'll go to book title, click on that drop down, and hit remove field. We're going to move copyright from the rows to the columns. Notice how our pivot table reacts to each one of those changes. Now, along the rows, we have discipline. On the columns, instead of edition, we now have copyright year. We've lost the book titles, and we've lost the editions. So very quickly we can rearrange, add things, remove things to change the dynamic nature of our pivot table. Okay, now we're going to talk about changing the value field settings. Put your cursor in B5, and we'll click on, we can do it in a number of different ways, but we can click on field settings if we wanted to, and notice that it brings up the value field settings. It says what's the name of that, and we're going to type, instead of sum of total book sales, we're going to type sales by discipline. Okay, and then it asks us if it's a sum, and then what we want to do is click on this button that says number format, and we're going to choose the accounting format, and we're going to have decimal places 0. Okay, so we're going to format all of these values that are contained from B5 to F13, I believe. I'm sorry, it gets the totals as well. So we got B5 through F14, and we now have the numbers in accounting format with 0 decimal places. So we've changed the settings of the value field settings for our data. Okay, now we want to change some of the titles. We've got sales by discipline, which is what we want, but now we have row labels and column labels, and those aren't very descriptive. So let's put our cursor in A4, and where it says row labels, let's change that to the word discipline. And in B3, where it says column labels, let's change that to copyright year. Okay, so now we're formatting the pivot table in a way that's more readable for anybody that's looking at it. So this is basically the title, sales by discipline. We've got copyright year in the columns, we've got discipline in the rows, and then we've got the grand totals for each discipline, and then one summary number at the bottom, which is 120 million in total book sales. Okay, the final thing that we're going to do in this hands-on exercise is we're going to change some of the data in the underlying spreadsheet. So this pivot table that we see in sheet 1 is based off of an underlying data set which is in books data. So all of the data here influences what our pivot table is going to look like. I'm going to go ahead real quick and change it from sheet 1 to pivot table. Okay, just so we know what's there. And in the books data sheet, I want you to change the value in J1 from 130% to 125%. So our markup rate is going to be 125% instead of 130. Now, if we look at the underlying spreadsheet, some of the values, all the values have changed. Let's go back to the pivot table, and the values have not changed. It still says 120 million. What we need to do to make changes from the underlying spreadsheet appear in our pivot table is to refresh the pivot table, and that's what this exercise is about. Click inside the pivot table to get the pivot table tools. We'll hit Analyze, and here it says Data, and we want to click on the Refresh button, and we want to refresh all. Okay? Alright, so the data has slightly changed. Our numbers have slightly changed to reflect that we have made a change over here in the underlying data. Go ahead and click Save, and we're done with hands-on exercise number 2.